Former NSA contractor Edward Snowden says he wants a fair trial in the U.S. He's been living in exile in Moscow since 2013 after leaking top-secret government documents.
He opens up about his decision in a new memoir titled Permanent Record. Earlier, he spoke with CBS This Morning about the day he landed in Russia and his life since then.
Well, this is actually a big scene in the book as soon as I landed. And for the audience that may be less familiar with the story, it was never my intention to be in Russia. I was actually transiting en route to Latin America. The United States government, for some reason, we don't know whether it was intentionally to create kind of a evergreen political attack against me, guilt by association of being able to point to the Russian government, or they simply panicked when they saw that I might be what they considered escaping. They canceled my passport, and that when I landed, I could no longer travel. So I get pulled out of passport control and brought into a room, and yes, directly, the Russian intelligence service is like, do you want to cooperate? Do you have any information? Life's going to be very hard if you have no one on your side. And I said, look, that's not how this is going to be. That's not how this is going to work. I don't have any information. You can search my bag if you want, because I destroyed my information before I got on the plane. And I think that was probably what they expected, because remember, there's about 4,000 journalists downstairs looking for me in this airport at the moment. I'm on every TV channel, I'm on every newspaper, and I was just trying to continue on my journey into asylum. Now, the reason that this actually happened, because you might be skeptical, you might go, well, the Russians are just going to let this guy go. Russia has, shall we say, a problematic human rights record at a minimum. That's if we're being generous. Now, when we look at the opportunities that they have to do the right thing on the international stage, it seems pretty few and far between. But here's a circumstance where they don't have to do anything to do the right thing. All they have to do is not hand me over. But even despite that, even the fact that Russia was probably the hardest place in the world for the CIA to operate, I didn't go, all right, this is great, let me out of the airport. I was stuck in that airport for 40 days.
Do you have concerns, Edward, that Russia is monitoring your actions today? Do you think that they're gathering intelligence on you? Because the optics, as we sit here in America, looking at you in Russia, the optics are not good.
No, you're absolutely right. Again, and I'm on the same side on this issue.
Then why not come home, Mr. Snowden?
one of the big topics in Europe right now is should Germany and France invite me in to get asylum. That's how they're handling the response to this new book. But when you look at that kind of thing, of course it's problematic, and of course I would like to return to the United States. That is the ultimate goal. But if I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison, the one bottom line demand that we all have to agree to is that at least I get a fair trial. And that is the one thing the government has refused to guarantee, because they won't provide access to what's called a public interest defense.
But Mr. Snowden,
you and I are talking about this right now. Go ahead.
Mr. Snowden, in all due respect, criminals and alleged criminals don't customarily get to decide the terms of their trial. They broke the law and they face the consequences. What makes you different?
Well, I'm not different. Again, I'm not asking for a parade. I'm not asking for a pardon. I'm not asking for a pass. What I'm asking for is a fair trial. And this is the bottom line that any American should require, right? We don't want people thrown in prison without the jury being able to decide whether what they did was right or wrong. The government wants to have a different kind of trial. They want to use special procedures. They want to be able to close the courtroom. They want the public not to be able to know what's going on. And essentially, the most important fact to the government, and this is the thing we have a point of contention on, is that they do not want the jury to be able to consider the motivations, why I did what I did. Was it better for the United States? Did it benefit us, or did it cause harm? They don't want the jury to consider that at all. They want the jury strictly to consider whether these actions were lawful or unlawful, not whether they were right or wrong. And I'm sorry, but that defeats the purpose of a jury trial.
For more on this, let's bring in New York Times book critic Jennifer Szalai. She's joining us now. Jennifer, you wrote a review of Snowden's new memoir. Why should someone, or why would someone who values privacy so much write a memoir? What is he trying to convey?
Well, so I think that this is actually one of the central questions that I had, and that I think everybody would have about this book. You know, he's been so hesitant to talk about his private life. He's a privacy advocate. And here he is putting something that's actually into the permanent record called Permanent Record. And I think that there are several ways of seeing this book. I mean, I think that his critics will undoubtedly impute probably the worst motives to this, which is that it's part of a sort of self-aggrandizing project. And then there are those who see him as, you know, solely as a hero, and so could only see this in the best light. And I think one could look at this book as an extension of his privacy advocacy work in a way, because, you know, we live in a day and age when, in order to get a message to really land with people and to really resonate, you know, presenting the facts of what happens in terms of mass surveillance of American citizens, I mean, that only sort of registers so much. And I think once it's sort of tied to somebody's story, that's when people really begin to absorb it. So if you read the book, that really does seem to be the way it's structured, which is, this is how I, Edward Snowden, came to do what I did, and this is what my motivations were for doing what I did, which seems to be the main point of this book.
And so I take it that that also includes his childhood. How did his childhood, do you think, shape, you know, what he ended up doing, the decisions that he made?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's interesting because, well, first of all, so Snowden was born in 1983, so it makes him old enough to really remember a different era of the internet in the 1990s, when it was more freewheeling. It was less involved in terms of monetization. People weren't necessarily banking online. You know, this was a time when he really remembers it being a place that was liberating, where he could, and other people could, adopt different identities, find different points of connection. It's a little bit idyllic in his view. And so he contrasts that with what it has since become, where people feel really tethered, not just to a single identity. So people are caught out online for saying things in the past that they might not say again today, but also with being tethered to their offline identity. So there's a way in which, you know, people can be watched, tracked, surveilled when they're, you know, looking at their phones, when they're looking at their computers. So I think him remembering a different time is part of it. He also does say that growing up in a family that, in his words, was dedicated to public service. You know, his mother worked for the NSA, his father for the Coast Guard, his grandfather for the FBI, that he sees his act, or at least he presents his act, as a form of public service. So I think that's also a big part of the book, that he wants people to read it and understand why he presented these documents to journalists.
You know, Jennifer, I don't know if you got a chance to watch this interview that he gave to our colleagues over at CBS This Morning, but he seemed, yeah, what was your take on some of the answers that he gave? It struck me that he seems very confident, some perhaps might say arrogant, in his sense of righteousness. Self-righteous is perhaps what someone would say, and that he is going to leave it to others to judge his place in history, but he has no secondary qualms or thoughts about what he did. He's still fully confident in that. Is that how you read the interview?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, and you see it in the book. I mean, I think the book, you know, the book is a really fascinating, compelling read, I think, for anybody, you know, no matter how one feels about Snowden, whether or not you've made up your mind about him. But I think, yes, he comes across as very confident, and he doesn't seem to have really any regrets about what he did. And I mean, you know, to a certain extent, that makes sense. I mean, if you do something that audacious, that extreme, I think that one would have to have that confidence, and one, if he's going to continue to talk about privacy in front of audiences all over the world, he really has to believe that, or say that he believes it. I mean, I think that, you know, so I wasn't necessarily surprised by how he presented it. But I did find, you know, the interview interesting. It was interesting to see how he responded to questions about why doesn't he come back, you know, why, you know, that the optics of him being in Moscow right now, I think, as one of the hosts put it, doesn't really look good.
Right, because it's such a, I mean, talk about privacy, and you're not living in a Scandinavian country, you're living in one of the most repressive regimes
and
in
you're
the world.
living there at the generosity of Vladimir Putin. I mean, he's essentially doing you a favor by allowing you to stay there.
Well, I do think one of the things I did, you asked earlier about why this book right now from somebody who is usually so hesitant to talk about his private life. You know, he does say something in that interview, which I thought was very interesting, which he said that he's noticed that in Germany and France, and I think this is partly something that he himself has brought up in interviews that he's had with news organizations in those countries, there is this question of whether or not those countries will give him asylum now in response to this book. So I think, part of telling his story, part of sort of explaining the motivations of why he did what he did, as he said in the interview, he himself sees a distinction not just between the question of was it lawful or was it not lawful, but was it right or was it wrong? And this book seems to be a way for him to sort of put the question more on those moral grounds rather than the strict legal grounds, which I think is part of what he wants to do.
Do you know why he wrote this book now? Why he thinks this is good timing?
I mean, I do think that, there is the question of, if you tell your story, if what he says about, wanting to perhaps seek asylum in Germany or France is true, I mean, I think that this book perhaps would go some way toward at least him trying to make his case. I think also in terms of his privacy advocacy work, that this book really does contain a lot about how his own, not just his own life story, but how his way of thinking went into doing something like this. And so I think on that score, it really sort of hammers home the points that he's trying to make. And I think he's also trying to make it at a time when people have started, if not to take for granted, that we're always being tracked by our apps, but they don't even necessarily think about it much anymore. So he really wants to draw attention to that.
Right. Jennifer Szalai, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.